Ricky was kind enough to agree to spend some time educating you guys on how it all works and the value that comes from it. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Ricky and let him take it from here.
Thank you, Christine. Yes, I definitely am going to be talking about some of the wins that we saw in our time together, because obviously we wouldn't be talking today if we hadn't seen positive results from our ABM journey. So before I go on, rather than just having a typical agenda slide, I thought I would talk about what this presentation is and isn't going to be. What this isn't going to be is it's not going to be an academic step-by-step guide. Really what I wanted to share was sort of my key takeaways from our journey based off of my marketing focus, and I'll talk about my focus in just a minute. It's also not going to be everything that you need to know. You're not going to come out of this presentation, unfortunately, necessarily with a turnkey framework to work with. But I am going to share resources. I'm going to share some frameworks, and I'm going to share some of the researchers that were invaluable to me when I was going through my ABM journey. So just briefly about me professionally, I really kind of have started pegging myself as a growth marketer, specifically within the B2B space. And what that means is I'm really focused on the processes. I'm really focused on the people and the technologies that drive business growth. And in that capacity, as Christine mentioned, we were able to drive tens of millions of dollars in influence, pipeline, and wins. And this is so critical for me to say, all that was done in partnership with sales. It was not through direct sales. The other thing is currently I'm serving in a marketing team lead capacity at GSP Retail here in the Tampa Bay area. And informally, I'm also serving as the voice of the customer in an agile marketing process that we're running there. So how did this journey start? The journey almost always starts with sort of the loosening of the status quo. There were several things that were happening that made us start to think about adopting ABM. And I've listed some of those out here. There was a need to transition the organization from reactive quoting to more proactive solution selling. There was activities that were certainly taking place at a very high level there, and the marketing needed to support that. There was also a lack of visibility into and buy-in from our sales counterparts. When Christine and I are working together, and specifically in one of the business units, it's something that we were very exposed to. There was a legacy focus on reporting on production versus reporting on results. As a result of that, there was rampant what we would call random acts of marketing. So marketing activities that were not strategically aligned. And in this case, I'm not necessarily referring to the things that Christine and I were working on, but as an organization overall, there was rampant RAM. And another thing that was taking place externally was now there was becoming availability of targeting and personalization capabilities. And then the last one, I think this is critical for me personally, is I was approaching the age of 40, and I am honestly still undergoing this sort of existential crisis in a search for meaning for how I'm choosing to spend 8 hours or more of my life each day. That I started off as a design, in a design capacity, and specifically made the switch to more of a marketing capacity because I really wanted to drive results. Another thing that happened is, like I mentioned, it was starting to get out there, ABM technologies, and I myself was becoming a target for other companies in their ABM efforts. And in a space where I was seeing diminishing results from my marketing activities, to have something that would actually resonate with me got me thinking about, well, how can I do this? So as we were considering making the switch here, one of the first things we knew we needed to do is we needed to start getting some buy-in from our sales counterparts and from other people in the organization. So what we started to do was really trying to bring ourselves up to speed and start building alignment with our sales team. So I had a series of meetings and discussions with various people in our sales department, asking them about their sales process, walking me through a typical customer set of interactions, because we had at the bottom, we could see where we were impacting people from the marketing side, but we, like I said earlier, had very little visibility into what was happening in real time on the sales side. And then what was starting to become more clear, especially after multiple discussions, that there was there's a common set of interaction points that were taking place both on the marketing and on the sales side. And here's an example of that. So in order to bring myself up to speed and to ensure that I wasn't just sort of going at it blind, there was a number of resources that were available to me that I found invaluable in trying to get going in the right direction. As you saw in one of my previous slides, I was sent a book as a part of a company trying to gain our business using ABM. And in fact, you'll see that book still on my bookshelf back there. Another one for me was an audio book that you see in the middle. Of course, there's LinkedIn learning resources, especially now. And then I would say probably most valuable to me was the research that was available to us from Gartner early on, and then more recently from Serious Decisions, which was acquired by Forrester. For whatever reason, their frameworks and their methodology just really, it clicks with me. And you'll see that spread throughout this presentation. So let's go back to fundamentals here, because I think ABM is an opportunity to do just that. And as you saw on my title slide, I've come to the opinion that ABM is really just a formality of B2B. So when we think about the different levels within an organization or within a B2B marketplace, at the highest level, you've got things such as industry or geographies or things like relative company sizes. Within that marketplace, you have a number of accounts, which are, of course, the buying entity where the contractual relationship exists. Within an account, you'll have multiple buying centers, or you can call them business units. And then within those, you could have multiple buying groups, which is a collection of various different personas that are involved in the buying process. And then we'll talk more about personas a little bit later. Just a slide to talk about the need for this formality within B2B is that it differs quite a bit from a B2C approach. There's a lot that does carry over from B2C into B2B in terms of tactics and in terms of messaging, but really what it comes down to, the buying process, that looks quite different, both in terms of number of people involved, and you can see here that, you know, at the bottom here, if you're looking at a buying group of perhaps 1 or 2 people, that represents relatively smaller price ranges of offerings with corresponding timeframes for purchase. And then as you work your way up, as we typically did in Jabil, we're looking at the very least, we're looking at that middle row there. And in most cases, we're talking about a buying committee of a number of personas. This is the framework that was originally presented to me through Serious Decisions. What I really want to call in, and we're not going to go through all of the line items here, I'm going to provide these slides to you so that you can go through them in detail, and hopefully they're as useful to you as they were to me. Really what I wanted to call out here is the time frame here. So if you're looking at this and you're saying 12 months, wow, 12 months, does it really take that long? Through our pilots, we really truly saw that. And in fact, when it comes to the ramp up, which is really in the Serious Decisions framework, months 1 through 3, we actually saw longer time frames for us to kind of get our programs up and running. And I'll talk about that. But the other thing I'll mention is that within our first pilot, we saw our first opportunity at month 9. And in fact, we saw our first win with that opportunity just a month later. And we saw our first opportunity within the time frame of the first year. We saw our first opportunity with our second pilot at month 7. So why was it taking us longer to ramp up? Like I said, I think ABM, when you start going at it, is an opportunity to kind of go back to basics. And what we found was our business units that we were piloting with really did not have some of the fundamentals in place in terms of thinking about who is their ideal customer profile. And we needed to validate personas. In some cases, they didn't have personas, in case it was a ground up initiative. And then in some cases, they had personas, but those were not necessarily developed with the frameworks that we had in place and the methodologies that we had in place. And in some cases, we found redundancies. And then, of course, most critical for me in the way that I approach ABM is the buyer's journey. And then you'll see that some of the other items here on our pilot process are mostly just a lift and shift from the serious decisions methodology. So why do I think it's important, actually critical, to start with the ideal customer profile? Well, it's going to inform several of the elements that we're gonna talk about later. So it's gonna obviously set your criteria for account targeting. It's gonna help you in terms of identifying what's the right persona mix within your buying dynamics. And then it can also, at its deepest level, it can inform which products or solutions you're bringing to the table as a part of your campaigns and programs. It's also going to allow you to avoid the quagmire of just assuming that anyone and everyone that could buy for you is somebody who will buy from you. And it, obviously, for us, it was really important to stay scrappy. We did not have a huge amount of resources, both in terms of man count or in terms of budget. So we really had to play it safe in terms of not exposing ourselves to significant resource strain or waste. And then it allows us to focus our efforts and our funds on the targets with the highest propensity to buy. So in other words, by starting with an ICP, you're stacking the deck in your favor. So a guiding principle that I heard that I really just absolutely love is this with regards to what's our North Star for defining what an ICP is. It's the highest average sale in the shortest possible time with the lowest chance of churn. Again, it's about stacking the deck in your favor when you're going about ABM. The point of this slide is really just to show that when it comes to selecting the criteria for your ICP, it's going to be a mixture of internal factors and external factors. Internal factors such as product fit. Is the sales team for these accounts ready to sell within this framework? And then external factors like, are there trends taking place within the set of accounts marketplace that are driving the need for change? So here's an example of an ICP that was set for one of our pilots. We knew that we wanted to choose companies that our products were the right fit. In our case, it was rigid injection molding with some level of complexity. Okay, so not an off-the-shelf package. We obviously had some annual revenue targets in order for us to reach the scale that we needed in order to be profitable. We chose, because we could identify accounts out in the marketplace that had stated corporate sustainability goals. So we could go out to our suspected target accounts and we could see whether or not they were making statements about sustainability targets that they were setting over 5-10 years. And then we also knew that we wanted organizations that we suspected were engineering-led versus procurement-led. So that would lead us into a conversation that wasn't necessarily going to be nickeled and dimed, or whether the solution would be considered viable just based off of a dollar amount. And then obviously we wanted, kind of going along with the corporate sustainability goals, were these organizations where there were designated sustainability leaders or people with sustainability in their titles. And then proximity to relevant facilities. So
hey, Ricky.
Now, yeah, go ahead.
Hey, quick question on that. Sorry to interrupt, but when it comes to defining the ideal customer profile, did you face any challenges or headwinds from the business units to define the ICP versus having a business unit's attention focused solely on, different account logos? So
I did not. Hopefully I'm reiterating this throughout the presentation, is all of this is done in partnership with our sales counterparts. That's critical, is you've got to have buy-in from, I'll call it the revenue team, which for us primarily meant that we were partnering with sales. So it was a discussion. They were part of that discussion in terms of helping us define what that criteria was. We had some ideas, they had some ideas. In one of our pilots, we really weren't involved in the selection of the accounts. It was basically, here are the accounts, help us how you can. And then the second scenario is where we had the opportunity to do the ICP. And then just kind of the last bit on this. My approach to marketing isn't that there's just one magic formula. I think there's any number of ways that you can go about it and still see success. So we saw success in that first pilot where we were very involved in account selection, and we also saw success in that second one where we were more involved in being more focused in which accounts we had. And then, and one final point on that is ABM is a really iterative process. So you can start off with a set of accounts, but eventually what you're going to find is some of them you're not going to be able to reach. Some of them, they just simply aren't buying. And you will probably eventually find that there's accounts that are going to come to you through an inbound fashion that you weren't originally targeting, that you choose and say, well, they really should be. So let's formally include them in our program. So that was way more information than I think you were getting at. Did I at least answer the question?
Yeah, I think you answered it well. The challenge that we're seeing is we're still focusing more on logos versus the ICP, and I think a lot of times we're not even in alignment within sales and our businesses with the logos that we're targeting. So I think taking the approach of taking a step back and focusing on the ICP versus the specific accounts would help bring us in better alignment.
Another thing that you're going to see in a little bit is this concept of a pilot, and you could use the pilot to say, okay, we're going to focus on this set of accounts, which in your mind is actually the ICP, again, kind of stacking the deck in your favor, and based off of the results of that, expand that out to other logos that maybe aren't, at least initially, within your ICP. Okay, so kind of to get back on track with regards to personas, this is another area where, again, we came to one of the business units and they kind of had an idea, a set of personas, and then the second we were really developing it from the ground up. So again, kind of like I was doing at the beginning of the presentation, here's what I think a persona is. Well, actually, I think this is somewhat lifted from Serious Decisions. It's an aggregation of similar job roles. These people have similar initiatives, they have similar challenges, they have similar watering holes. So the main point being here is that it's an aggregation. It is not an exhaustive list of job titles from everybody in the CRM. If we are, and I assume that you all, like we were, if we have limited resources, trying to create programs and reach with individualized, personalized content to 50 different personas is not viable. And then the other point that I want to make is we're talking about personas that are for accounts that are within your ICP. So don't create a persona if it's not somebody who doesn't fall within that sort of ideal view of what an account should be, or what the ideal count is. And then kind of just to reiterate it, what we found was there were some redundancies between different personas, in which case we either merged them or eliminated them in our pilots. Here's a nice little framework here that you can use to develop your personas. I will be honest here, we didn't necessarily go through a formal process of it. What was most important for us is to identify the different job titles that a persona could have, which helped us in prospecting. Obviously, buyer needs was extremely important for us, knowing the initiatives they were involved in, knowing the challenges that they were involved in, and then also knowing how prevalent were they? Were they a decision maker? Were they our champion? Or were they just a user? So these are some of the different types of buyer roles that could help guide you in terms of prioritization is mostly what I want you to take away from this. If you have a clear champion that always shows up or usually shows up in some of your best deals, obviously you spend a lot of time identifying and nurturing those roles. And then if you're trying to prioritize content creation, well, maybe you don't need to spend so much time, or maybe marketing doesn't really have such a strong impact when it comes to a ratifier type buyer role. This is leading me into a conversation about the buyer's journey. The buyer's journey is one of those, another one of those critical components for me. And by the way, we haven't really even gotten into ABM just yet, the elements of ABM just yet. This is all just very critical elements to feed into your ABM initiative. But effectively, Serious Decisions breaks down the process into these 3 different stages. The key point here is that in order for somebody to commit to your solution, they need to know that your solution exists, and they need to know that it applies to their needs. At the same token, they're not going to explore solutions if they don't recognize that they have a problem or an opportunity and they haven't committed to change yet. So that's the full buyer's journey. Here's where the personas kind of wrap into it. Each persona ideally will have a somewhat unique journey through the different stages here. And then very similar to what I was showing at the beginning, there's probably a common set of interaction points. Now, the ideal way of starting to map out a buyer's journey is to actually have conversations with your customers or with prospective buyers. However, if that's not viable, you can either take your best guess at it and observe the results and adjust. As I said, this is an iterative process. Or like we did, we had conversations with our salespeople and they told us the interactions that they were seeing. And it's not just about one persona. You can't just focus on one person. Maybe you start with one and work your way through the rest of them. But in essence, if you're trying to progress an account or a buying center, it's the aggregate of the personas that show up within that buying center or in the buying group. So now I'm going to make the transition into some of the more formal parts of ABM. And I think this is really important. The biggest challenge when it comes to adopting ABM is the fact that it has a potentially grand scope and it has a wide variety of applications. And what I'm presenting to you is based off of my focus as a growth marketer in driving revenue and helping influence opportunity generation. Some people will tell you that ABM is a targeting capability. It is. And it's also a business strategy if you choose to apply it that deeply into your business. It all just depends on your focus. If any of you have started to research ABM at all, this is probably quite familiar to you, that there's a number of different approaches that you can use when you're thinking about your available resources, when you're thinking about how many different accounts to choose and how deeply to go. Obviously, at the highest level, you're seeking the highest potential ROI. These are your big name accounts and you are generating content specifically for those accounts. When we get to the middle stage, which is I consider to be more of ABM at scale, you're lumping similar companies together. You're not necessarily creating content for an individual account, but you're creating content based off of at least an ICP. And then at the bottom is what we have, what I would call more marketing to accounts. You're not necessarily using it to inform your strategy, but you're at least focusing your resources on a set of named accounts. By the way, the one in the middle is the one that we effectively were using over the last few years. So an important part of ABM is account research. And this will vary based off of how you're going about ABM. For us, we spent a lot of time looking into the company history. Did we have previous engagements with the company? Were they a customer at one point and then they fell out of favor with us? Do we have an existing connections either, and especially if there were existing connections within the board level? Was there relevant account news that was happening? Did they bring in a new CMO or something like that that we could use to capitalize on and maybe have a greater chance of initiating some change here? What sort of needs could we identify for them and what sort of priorities did they have? And then, of course, one of the important parts, critical parts of this is identifying your personas and sourcing contacts. The last thing I'll mention on this one is just, it's really important that you determine whether or not you have the ability to reach an account given the tactics. So if one of your tactics is sponsored social media, targeted accounts, well, do they have enough people on LinkedIn for you to actually reach a minimum level that you need for an audience? And just to hammer this home, start small, measure, and scale what works. It's an iterative process, and it's always recommended to start with the pilot. Why start with the pilot? Well, if you're going after, let's just say, the 50 biggest companies in your industry, maybe you don't want to play experimentation with all of them all at once. Maybe you want to take a selection of them again, start small, figure out what works, and then scale out from there once you know that what you're using and the tactics that you're using is working. So just some general guidelines, maybe up to 25% of your overall selection of accounts, and it depends on your approach. And then there are some minimum advertising considerations. So for us, we were utilizing targeted telemarketing, and even though there's that usually takes place at a large scale, we found a firm that was willing to work with us at a minimum users of 200 to 300 contacts. You could choose a single geography. You could choose a single product line in your business. You could do it based off of how much data is available for the accounts. So there's a number of different ways that you can use to sort of set a scope for your pilot. As an example, one of the ones that we chose was we found about 20 companies. That's what we started off with. By the end, we had eliminated some of them because we weren't able to reach them or they weren't in market. Roughly about 200 contacts total is what you want to have. And when I say contacts, it's name, job title, and at least an email address or a telephone number, some way for you to contact them directly. We chose to focus on a single market because we had a differentiated offering for them. For us, it was really important that it wasn't just vaporware, that there were real solutions in that space so that we didn't have to prove to them that this was a real offering. They were at the volume that we needed, and the marketplace was available for the types of solutions that we were going to be providing. We chose to focus on the European Union because that was the location of our champion sales reps, and that region also had recently undergone some regulations that made it a necessity for accounts in this space to explore sustainable solutions, was effectively what we were doing. Account development planning is, again, going to depend on your approach. What I would say is what you want to do is you want to have a regular meeting cadence. You can start developing the plan, but the plan is going to be evolving as you go. And that regular cadence allows you to incorporate new findings as you go. Some common topics to include are going to be like the account updates. Were there notable acquisitions? Have some of our personas left to go to other companies, or perhaps personas from one of your targets make a shift to another of your targets? What new prospects have you found either through inbound activities or through ongoing prospecting activities? What sort of recent engagements were taking place? And you're especially looking for those buying signals. So remember that buyer's journey that I was talking about. Reading a blog article about some of the common pain points that an account might be seeing maybe isn't a strong buying signal, but if they fill out that contact us form, well, that's obviously a big, strong buying signal that they want to talk to somebody in sales. And you can either reactively, in that case, reach out to them and say, how can we help you? But also in aggregation, if you're seeing like there's a trend here within an account of engagement moving towards that sort of buying process, well, maybe there's an opportunity for a salesperson to reach out and see if they can initiate some sales discussions. And then, of course, action items. Maybe we need to introduce a new email or a new template or something like that. And those assignments are, assigned to people, and you follow up on that. And then, of course, production updates for new assets that are being developed. You're doing this in aggregate, so you're talking about your overall set of accounts, but also within individual accounts. A key tool for us, based off of the buyer's journey, when we were thinking about, well, what do we need to produce in order to see the results that we're looking for with our set of accounts, was to step outside of those individual interactions. Instead of thinking about coming to our website and looking at individual web pages, let's try to get in the mindset of our customers, and let's think about the information that they need. And then let's develop, first of all, let's find if we have any existing resources, web pages, blogs, assets that we can map to those needs and make available to them when they need it, but also identify gaps. Where's there we feel a very strong need in order to progress the account that we don't have anything available to them. And it's kind of up to them. We're just leaving it up to them to try and figure it out. That allows us also in this process to look at who are our champions. Is there sort of a critical path of personas and information needs that we need to focus on first? Because we obviously can't spend forever talking through the strategy and then talking through and developing content, at a certain point, you have to say, well, we need to pull the trigger on this. We need to validate that this is working and then continue building it out as we go. So this kind of reiterates some of the things I was just mentioning. What this will also do is, if you find that there are personas that have relatively similar information needs, maybe those personas should be merged or eliminated. And then obviously you're identifying gaps for production and prioritization. Another thing that's really important for me is tracking. So you always got to be keeping track of what's taking place here. And if you're smart about how you're creating your assets and tracking those assets, that can be the signal for you to see how the account is progressing. Frankly, this is the part that everybody gets excited about, and unfortunately, it's the one where I have the least to say, because even though this is where the magic happens, it all depends on your unique scenario. It all depends on what accounts you're going after. I will share an example next of a type of program that really seems to work well here. But coming back to fundamentals, I really view that the content that you've mapped in that buyer's journey is really the backbone of your campaigns and programs. And then what you're going to be doing from there is you're going to be using targeted channels. And they're going to be both the marketing and sales channels in order to get your prospects or get your personas engaged in the program, and also to progress them through the journey that you have. And your campaigns and programs then are going to be about introducing new content if you identify gaps, or you're going to swap out assets. Like, for example, if an asset is underperforming in your opinion and they don't seem to be getting past that, try swapping it out for a different type of asset. So what do I mean by that? Maybe there's a really important topic that's currently being covered by a blog, but that blog isn't really getting a whole lot of traction, and especially isn't moving people to the next stage. Maybe spend some more time or try an alternative format such as a webinar or something like that, where you can actually get engagement and step them through it. And then, of course, scale what works. So I know that this is an eye chart, and it is a chart indeed. What I would say is, remember I was talking before about we were trying to move away from random acts of marketing and think more about journeys. So a series of touch points. I think that webinars are a great way of kind of moving people very deliberately through a set of touch points here. So, and the other point that I want to make here is that it allows you to try a lot of different engagement channels. So in this case, we use paid ads to promote the live webinar. And the other reason why webinars are great for me is that it allows you to capture a lot of activity within a very short predefined set of time. So we were utilizing paid ads. We were incorporating telemarketing. We had email marketing taking place, as well as sales activity, both in email and in social media taking place, all moving them through. Each of the touch points moves them to the next touch point, up until we get to the point. Ultimately, our goal was to get people to request a consultation. So on the topic of reporting and tracking here, again, this is another area where it's just going to depend on how you're going about it, what you need to track. So TMs stands for the metrics that matter the most. And then to layer on that, when they matter the most. So early on, if you're looking at the chart here, the short-term metrics that you're keeping an eye on is your readiness to launch your ABM initiative. So that's things like, have your customers been identified or your accounts been identified? Have you mapped the life cycle stages? And then at the very end, of course, is kind of your long-term goals. So for us, it was wins. But obviously, before we got to wins, we had to have opportunities. And in order to have opportunities, we needed to be progressing an account through the buyer's journey. And you're looking at these results both at the account level and then at the aggregate level. So let's talk about results real quick to wrap this up here. I talked about the fact that we had 2 targets here. What you're looking at is more or less an account version or account-based version of a lead funnel. So in a lead funnel, you have sort of your perhaps untargeted interactions taking place, so an inquiry or a download or something like that. And then you're funneling them through the different stages here up until you are identifying pipeline and wins. So in our first pilot, which took place in the aerospace segments, we had about 28 targets, and you can see that we were moving them down until a year later, we had 3 wins. On the right-hand side, for our second one, at the time of this chart's creation, we only had 1 that was in pipeline. And I also chose to include some quotes from our salespeople there because I think this is critical. As I mentioned, ABM is an opportunity to align with your revenue team and especially with your sales team. And so part of what we were doing is we wanted to get their buy-in, and we needed them to be advocates for us as we were asking for more resources, or as we were taking these pilot programs, showing them to other business units and trying to convince them that they should also go about their ABM adoption. My last takeaway from this is don't wait to start. In my view, ABM is just B2B, and you're either going to be strategic about how you're going about B2B or you're not. Hopefully you all, hopefully I answered some of the questions that you had at the beginning of this, and now I welcome any questions or any discussion topics that you might have. By the way, if any of you are shy, it's perfectly understandable. Here's my contact information, and regardless of whether or not you have a question for me, I'd love to hear from you. Connect with me on LinkedIn. At some point, hopefully you'll have a question that maybe I can answer, or if you just need somebody to ping an idea off of. In my opinion, talk is cheap, so let's go ahead and do it.
No, thank you, Ricky. Sorry, I was just trying to get my headset going again. No, I think this is really great. And you know what resonated with me in the very beginning of when you started was the whole RAM, the random acts of marketing. And I think we see that sporadically throughout the organization. So definitely having the strategy. I do like how, this is, certainly ABM is just a formality of B2B, and you really kind of took, at least for me, the mystery of ABM and just really kind of put it into plain, common sense kind of marketing strategies, but certainly applying those strategies. So I think with what and I'm going to have to lean on my team but is really, developing what metrics that we need to identify, especially when we're talking with the sales leaders that we work with, and then in conjunction with the BUs, so that we can, certainly track all of our efforts and then be able to then discuss, all the wins. And, I feel that success breeds success. So we definitely have to be able to, I think, to your point, start small so that we can get a handle on it and do it right the first time, and then we can build upon that. So
yeah, I think that's critical. I think you just touched on something that really didn't show up in this presentation necessarily, but is aligning your metrics, your goals to the goals of the organization, and especially to your sales team. So we became less focused on production, and we became focused on more of the things that they wanted to talk about. They wanted to talk about those pipeline and wins. So if that's the goal, we're all going towards it. That's sort of the impetus for alignment, right?
Yeah. How long did it take you to get to that, I guess, realization?
That was pretty well known at the beginning, is that we didn't want to talk about things that were relevant to them. So we didn't necessarily want to talk about, trying to find an example. I call them vanity metrics. Your salespeople don't really care about how many people are coming to your website or how many people are necessarily downloading an individual asset, right? They were looking for things that were more about, well, hey, can I talk to this person, or is it a waste of my time, right? And it's a way of prioritizing those sorts of actions that they needed to take.
Good. Okay. Thank you, Ricky.
Thank you.
Ricky, my former boss and I worked with Bob Peterson at Serious Decisions probably 4 or 5 years ago. And awesome. Everything you're saying is spot on. And it is about, you have short-term, mid-term, and long-term goals. And I remember one of the things that when we first started, and we were talking about, we were on a conference call with him, and he was explaining to Christine's former predecessor how this, kind of works. And he was surprised to hear that it was going to take 18 months, and yet it did. But you saw the short-term, long-term, and midterm results, and it works. It absolutely works.
So how did you guys manage sort of prioritizing which ABM campaigns to run?
Yeah, great question. Ultimately, what it came down to us is finding those internal champions. Who are the ones that are willing to give it a shot, willing to fail a couple of times on the road to greater success?
Yeah, and I think it's also, it bears repeating that at the end of the day, if the business isn't ready, it doesn't make sense to try to force it. What we found, to Ricky's point, is that we had some champions who knew that this was the type of program that their business needed in order to be able to get it off the dime, and particularly a number of salespeople who were enthusiastic and willing to put in the time that was required to do it right. But the fact is that there were countless other business units that didn't have enough foundational development and assets from a marketing standpoint to actually meet the success criteria for an ABM program. So we had the opportunity to choose the ones that were ready and demonstrate some value and demonstrate some wins early, so that the others that weren't quite ready would then raise their hand. And that's in fact what happened. We were starting to pick up some really nice momentum with those divisions, and supporting their efforts to understand and learn what it takes to do this ABM thing right. And it would have ultimately made a huge difference, and I think it actually still is in our absence. Thank you guys so much for being here. And Ricky, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to educate the team on something that you've become quite expert at over time. And have a wonderful week, and we'll talk soon.